so sa shi pati can say trick Deva la bene già c'è già in mezzo a ambitane le votola tu sogni namo la yega danno danno yega trovata da yega no do quindi danno ci sa va yega do da c'è dentro convete già va giù cava me va che me va c'è va tame va me va tro me va tade demi teji me trova ni si tambo so yo sanya mana tamba de la cha cha lo so ya ta kare so na Dadi kase, jiden dewe debe nala, nuruki, ra, kanzi sere, ore, jiden dewe debe nala, dunga rangi che wada, shenji che da, niga che, jume bani toge de, cheni tenji dewa chung, o, suwa na se, tenji dewa chung wani, teni tongba ni tu che, 我把上心当启动吧，年没学习生给着，俺呢这把送那些钱呢，他开始说也是呢，看上看你他妈那些钱呢，懂啊？俺呢让个钱往打来进我等开，俺呢先来叫我等开，俺呢看说说你个来叫我等开，俺呢准备来叫我等开，他听着要我一张。 俺那先来叫我等个，俺打开说的，让就把那些听着我一张，我听着了，东啊，让给钱我的，先去钱咱一个钱，准备把那多个对，我多给我的那个对吧？ 去年等级这我穷，是你们三个去大家三个天呢，俺那东啊，我的天上来接，他是来接吧，没人吧？俺那让个下来等来穷啊，俺那让个遇见来等来穷啊，去年等级这我穷还是，
Oh, yes. Now, what should we say today? Then there's a verse actually from the Praise to the Transcendent by Master the Protector Nagarjuna. And in that verse he says, the suffering created by oneself, suffering created by others, suffering created by both, suffering created without a cause. The dialecticians, those who engage in specious forms of reasoning, they hold those kinds of positions. To them, then the lion of the Shakyas roars the roar of dependent origination. So that verse then the idea of the things that suffering arises from itself, meaning here that there's a cause which already has the suffering embedded in it intrinsically, and then from that the suffering arises, or that the suffering arises from some cause which is intrinsically other than the effect, the suffering that arises, or the notion that suffering arises from some combination of something that is intrinsically other and something that is intrinsically identical with the effect, the suffering, or the notion that suffering arises causelessly, that just occurs randomly without any cause whatsoever. All of those ideas or notions are entertained by the opponents here. With the second position, the notion that suffering arises from some kind of intrinsically other cause, that the cause that gives rise to suffering is intrinsically other or different from the effect suffering itself. That sort of idea is posited by other Buddhist philosophers, not the Madhyamika, true Madhyamika philosophers. But in any case, to all of these various positions which are articulated by these dialecticians, people who are engaged in specious forms of reasoning, then the lion of the Shakyas, the Lord Buddha, he's called the lion of the Shakyas, roars dependent origination, which is showing that in the case of things like suffering, which is a functional or created phenomenon, then it necessarily it arises in dependence upon either the specific causes and conditions that give rise to it in a causal sense, or it occurs in dependence upon the various parts that compose it. So it's designated in dependence upon the parts that make it up. And so that's the roar of dependent origination is given to those who posit these faulty or impossible forms of the origin of suffering.
Oh yeah, that's Jabatela, and it go shen sungia younger meba. Katerashin Namdashi, Singida Yayansu, Karasu to Lesumba, tell us to you come by new Jenny, or tended to be not a son, Nashi Jenny. Sidanago Taja, and Rashi Tomba, Kajan Rashi, Namashin Namdashi, Singida Yayansu, Karasu to Lesumba. On a tender watela, go a share conquer younger member in tell us to you come by new Jenny, or that this one, yeah.
So the remainder of that passage then from the praise to the transcendent continues by saying that dependent origination we call emptiness, and this is the lion's roar here, is that things are devoid of intrinsic nature, and when that lion's roar is given, then there's no opportunity for an opponent to have anything left to say. They're left without anything left to say in response to that. So the point that dependent origination is called emptiness. That's saying exactly the same thing in the or Master Nagarjuna here in the praise to the transcendent is saying the same thing that he said in the basic verses on the middle way, where he said that we call dependent origination emptiness. That's a dependent designation, and that is the middle way or middle path. So that verse says the same thing, implies the same thing or it's restated here in the praise to the transcendent. And this is likewise expressed in the praise to dependent origination by J. Rinpoche, Lord Tsongkhapa. And there he says as well that when one understands dependent or hears dependent origination, when that lion's roar of dependent origination is given, then those who hold other positions that posit some kind of real self, other, or both, neither kind of production of things, then they have nothing left to say. There's no opportunity for them to have anything left to say because their position has been demolished. And what could be more marvelous than that? A master like Lord Buddha who teaches dependent origination in this way.
Oh yeah, that day is Jenny Denjin Jawachung says Dende Telayang, and the Takar, Gujela Dene Jawatang. Ani Mingi Tanya Jawang Shatam, Ani Dende Yuba Yinsang. That Mingi Tanya Jawang Shatam Tela, Shatam, Ani Rashiji Tawe Tongjang, Mingi Tanya Jawang Shatam Tela, Ani Chachita Taba, the Takasa Digambari. 가상관이 그래서 쇼와 나신 셰리 민기 타내지 왕기 샤삼데라 아니 라신지 동장 민기 타내지 왕기 샤삼데라 아니 자체도 제태봐 와 인상 가서 타내도 연나 민기 샤바 잠이 봐 가로 셴나 타내도 연나 민기 타내도 여봐 왕기 샤바 잠이 봐 가로 셴나 타내도 여봐 인자 민기 따와 잠 말이 아고 유전을 때내 지기도가 아니 자질에서 나자 타기도가 대타바 인자 아니 민게 타왔다 민게 타냐 지왕게 따와서 말이지 라서나 나 될라 주메게 내자라 타냐 뒤에나 민게 타냐 지왕게 샤바자 임바 가로잖아 쩨메데스 가사기 타냐 다유 텐데랑 게 찬이지 좀 가서 쩨메데스 타냐 민게 샤바 쩨메서 가사다고 가서래 쩨메데 가사게 타냐 다유 텐데 랑게 찬이지 좀나 민게 타냐지 왕게 샤바 짬 제가 그 짬이 가르치고 와래서나 가사꾼도 제가 저거 말해서 저거 말해서 민게 타냐지 왕게 강사 탐자야 아니 군도 제가 봤던 거 말해서 그래서 그래서
고 가리를 민기 타니 그 왕기 샥섬 디 자치 탐
가사 타냐도 여봐 타냐도 여봐당 민기 타냐지 양 왕기 샤바니 어제 가르에서 샤바상 가로선하세 아니 가르세 군조도 여세다 민기 타냐지 왕기 샤바 담세야 돼 가끔 말해서 가사 군 아니 가사 민기 타냐지 왕기 샤바 짬이제 가사 민기 타냐지 왕기 마샤바 저그래서 와 마샤바 저지 민기 타냐지 왕기 가사 탐제야 군도 대봐야 말해서 가사 민기 타냐지 왕기 마샤바 저그래서 와 야나 들어당.
So now then we might say, well, what does this mean when the roar of dependent origination eliminates all of these various opponents' wrong views? Well, the position there is that dependent origination entails that things are devoid of intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature, And does that absence of intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature, the emptiness of things, entail that they're completely non-existent? No, that's not the case. What this entails is that phenomenal things are merely established through their being designated by the force of the conventions of language, the names and so forth, nominal conventions, the conventions of language. So we say, and when we say merely established by being designated through language, the conventions of language, that excludes their existing in any other mode, any other way, and specifically it excludes things existing by means of their own intrinsic identity. So the exclusion there, when we say merely established by the force of being designated by the conventions of language, names and so forth, then that excludes that any other kind of existence, being able to posit them as possessing some kind of intrinsic existence, intrinsic character, or intrinsic identity. But within that exclusion and the limitation of things as existing merely by through the power of being established by the force of the conventions of language, by names and so forth, then we nevertheless, within that mere nominal existence, can establish the relationships of agents and actions, all of the other kinds of conventional or phenomenal things that exist within the world. There's no problem establishing the phenomenal things within the world, but this does nevertheless exclude something. When other philosophers say, when they see things in the world, they say, okay, there's causality, we can see that agents perform actions, they produce effects, and things exist based upon the parts which compose them. Then they come to the assumption that there must be some objective existence of the things that are so observed, and they must necessarily exist objectively from their own side, and therefore have some kind of intrinsic identity or intrinsic identifiability. But here in this system of Madhyamaka, that's not the case, because that kind of intrinsic identity or objective existence would entail that they possess an intrinsic nature or an intrinsic character, which would not be merely established by the force of things being designated through the conventions of language. So that exclusion merely is crucial in excluding things having intrinsic identity, and then all of the other forms of intrinsic existence that would follow after that. And so that's that mere exclusionary word of excluding any other alternative is crucial in this context.
Oh yeah. 다 가서 민게 탄예도 왕기 샤바자모 용고 다와 잠시 잠지제 가사 탄예도 봐 마심 대한 미시 민게 왕 탄예지 왕기 가사 탐자양 안에 탄예도 봐야 군도도 봐 담바 많이 봐 오늘 가르쳐 거래서 아니 저번에 가르쳐 거래서 가사게 탄예 따위 되는데 아니 가사시 강라 탄예 따위 되는데 랑게 찬이지 좀나 아니 대코랑 그 니주권에 여바 송기 아니 탄예지 따위왕기 여바 뭐 송와데 아니 잡아래
So now then, so when we say merely established by the force of the conventions of language or names and so forth, that again excludes the things possessing intrinsic identity. Intrinsic identity here would refer to some kind of identity which is findable when one examines the object which is designated by a name or the conventions of language. And so it excludes that identity being intrinsic to the things that are are identified, but it does not exclude our ability to establish, for example, a person as existing. The person does exist phenomenally, it exists conventionally, as it's designated upon its basis of designation, in that case the collection of aggregates, and the same thing applies to all other conventional or phenomenal things. They all exist as they're designated by the force of the conventions of language, thought and language, but this excludes, what is excluded there is some kind of findable intrinsic identity or intrinsic existence that one would necessarily have to exist within the object which is designated by a term or a thought. And so that exclusion is excluding that intrinsic identity, but it's not excluding our ability, or it doesn't preclude our ability to establish things existing conventionally and phenomenally through the force of language and thought.
哦呀，听着我的这些就可以讲，最近就通过些为他呢，他听着我的这话，听着我的这些就可以讲说，全扩大你就我看我呢，也把送给他也就往给也把他马送马送这话也把马送我的，他结把一张听着我的这些就可把的。
That's when we say that the awareness, which results from reasoning, which is investigating the final nature of things, it doesn't find something. It negates phenomenal things. What it's doing is not negating the existence of the phenomenal thing. It's negating, or the conventional thing there. What it is doing is examining and looking for the final nature, ultimate nature of the phenomenal conventional thing, and it's eliminating when it does that, because it doesn't find anything under the phenomenal thing. It finds it's looking for the intrinsic nature, the intrinsic identity of the phenomenal thing, but since it doesn't find that, it finds a simple negation, and so we say that in the process of doing that, the phenomenal thing is negated, but the existence of that phenomenal thing is not negated in the process of examining or searching for its ultimate or final nature.
Oh yeah, 아니 시지 크장 아니 타냐점도 낭점되기 아니 최진지 통화타 해진기 통화 섬기 아니 타냐 봐도 그래 타냐 되면은 타냐비 세면 넣어 예장 가서 여봐도 주고 말해.
So when we say, for example, now conventionally we say Devadatta sees something. Devadatta is seeing something. That conventional statement, that statement is correct conventionally. There's no, and it's impossible to contradict that if that's the fact. So the reasoning, which is investigating the ultimate status of things, is negating some kind of ultimate existence or ultimate identity within the components of that statement, but it's not in any way rejecting or negating the simple conventional statement that Devadatta sees, because that if it were to do that, then the reasoning, which is or the awareness, which is the result of reasoning, investigating the ultimate status of things, would be contradicted by conventional valid knowledge, and then it would be false.
Oh yeah, 提出过的啦，看在那些人不是提出过的啦，对，听到他讲意见的，突然跟我你就要把马上嘛，安尼他讲就往个要把的原本里边住过来送完他。
So we say, as it says in the essence of good explanations, that the fact that things don't possess essence doesn't mean that they don't exist conventionally, because this conventional existence of things has to be accepted. It's indisputable without any question. We have to accept the conventional existence of things.
근데 자당하란 좀 낭잠되기 아니 자제 줘버려 신도야 까와 연장 어디 낭잠지 가상강 시원나 낭잠지 안에 되라 안에 자제 줘버려 신도 까와 연장 안에 다 리바테달라 때네 아니 요 랑점 되게 아니 자체 쳐봐대다 리바테달라 때네 왜매 리바테다 두고 와대 대대 송거 다 있나요 또 바꿔와 연장 아니 대달라 양내 강도 아니 매금 제쳐나야 번역 첨부여 와대 대대 송거 와들마 리바 매금 제쳐나 저 시티잖아 지 송어 영어요 가서 말한도 또 제제랑 그 찬이지 가서 오미다 제제到让个参议马主任让个参议安尼主把제제 탐제 안에让个参议主把啦恐怕写起话印章让参议主把啦原来主把的啦恐怕写起话印白是吧恐怕写起话印章让参议主把干巴啦안에让参议主把干的每个参议往个下巴怎么了안에 제제主把的落了没得样알아도落了没得样아니 조조는 일이 와 말에 민기 태야지 왕그 샤잠 되라 아니 제제 줘야 지당 랑그 천이지 주와라 제제 조조지기 일이 맞대 버래 아니 랑그 천이지 주와라 제제 조조 장난이 아니 죄만 보여 봐 여와 인장 아니 다 민기 태야지 왕그 아니 가서 샤바 잡라 제제 줘거래 매대양 아니 로디 티쳐서 장화차고 제를 송이 말에
So now then, so it's just the mere appearance of things, just things merely appear, and where these mere appearances of things we're able to establish through the force of the conventions of language and thought, and that's as far as it goes. That's all we can do is use these conventions of language and thought to establish how things operate, the way in which causes produce effects, the relationships between parts and wholes, all of the various necessary relationships and things that exist within the world. All of those are mere appearances, and these mere appearances are things which can only be established through the merely established through the force of the conventions of language and thought. So that's as far as we can go. Here, this is something that is very difficult to understand for people like ourselves. We are extremely habituated to assuming that things possess intrinsic identity, that they have objective existence, that they exist out there sort of objectively on their own in their own right, not simply established through the force of language and thought, through the conventions of language and the conventions of thought. So we're highly habituated to that, almost beginninglessly. We've and in the world, most people are operating under the assumption that things have objective existence, and we take that for granted. And in fact, when we're operating in the world, it's quite, as we see, people labor under this assumption that things exist objectively. They have their own intrinsic nature, intrinsic identity, and they're able to operate within the world and to a certain extent under that misconception. But if we compare the two, things existing by means of their own intrinsic identity on the one hand, and things existing by means of merely being established through the force of the conventions of language, these two are mutually exclusive categories. One or the other has to be the way things are. And if we investigate carefully the notion that things exist by means of their own intrinsic identity, we can find that all sorts of logical inconsistencies obtain, and that it's actually impossible for things to have intrinsic identity if we investigate this through reasoning carefully. But because we're so habituated to seeing things in that way, even if we hear it once or twice, we hear, oh, things don't possess intrinsic identity, they're merely established by the force of the conventions of language. That won't stick in our minds. We might think, oh, that's nice, and have some sort of aspiration to believe that. But because of our habituation to the alternative, seeing things as existing by means of their own intrinsic identity, we'll fall back into that and just continue in that way. So it requires a great deal of careful examination, and to first have to learn it and then sort of habituate ourselves to it. And in order to do that, it requires some care and an application to being able to understand this first, and then to gradually wear away at our habituation to the ordinary way of seeing things, which is seeing them as objectively established and existing by means of their own intrinsic identity.
냠샤기 생활 하마 키장하세 냠샤기 생활 유단 안에 최다 최전이가 키바 가서 최전 군조와 키가와 최이십이 생활 안에 동반님마도 안에 군조 하마 키바 군조 키바와 냠샤기 생활 하마 매바 키장 안에 대래 랑비 제도진에서 안에 사바데 라신지 주와 까네 안에 사바데 가르르 사카를 사도 하나 아니 아시 민잠시래봐 아시 민잠시 류봐 민태야 아니 또박이 다 심에도 고나 민잠 인간지기 아니 다시 자네매 봐 민태야 또배 심에도 제 심에도 다위 또다 민잠 또다 민양잠도 류봐라 내가 상에 되네 내가 얘네 민잠지 샤바텔라 아니 제바 제나 마 제바 얘네 마슈바 제바 민잠들라 제바 제메셰바 제바 제메셰바 아니 민잠지 태라 쇼바나 아니 레소바보다 대부 영화보다 사돈라 소바 롱 제바고 영화 참에 좀나 민잠티키 아니 동바당 땡중 송도지비텔라 내가 인타바네 예바 아니 가서래开下把这就在就在咱们定把去用啊，因为说的他就几把钱来过来。
Jupta joksul. Jupta joksul.
可是，开下把咱们就出的，就当没定把，俺用啊就说的。
So now then, the way this now in Master Ketubje has said that when we examine how things appear, particularly within the context of an Arya's meditative absorption on reality, within the context of that meditative absorption, the subject of the object which is observed, initially one takes a phenomenal thing as a basis of observation, and then investigating the final nature of that thing arrives at the simple negation, which is emptiness, the absence of intrinsic existence. So within the context of that vision within that meditative absorption, no phenomenal thing whatsoever appears. The object which is the base of any kind of phenomenal thing, which is the base of the emptiness which is ascertained, is not appearing at all. One has to say that the object as such no longer appears. So then when one arises out of that meditative absorption, then Arya comes out of that meditative absorption, then the mere I appears, and that mere I appears. I didn't get. I got it initially, and then I lost it.
민담지 류와텔라 잡아지야 마쇼바 아니 뒤텐라 쇼베 아니 레소바보다 저원요모바다 자동라 종 잡아보고 참에 tum니 땡데다 동바 송도 주부야다 아니 내가 띵 인타바네 예와
So now then, so when an Arya like that, who has understood emptiness perceptually through perception, They arise from that meditative absorption. And within the context of the meditative absorption, there's no phenomenal thing whatsoever appears. It's simply emptiness itself. And then they arise out, which is a mere negation. So when they arise out of that, then initially what will appear is the mere I. Here the mere I is a mental construct which occurs without any basis. It's not the mere I that's appearing. It's not being mentally constructed based on the basis of designation there, but it's just appearing sort of in an isolated fashion. And that mere I is here then is a mere designation. It's merely simply a designation and a mere mental construct. So once one is able to ascertain that mere I as a simple mental construct, as a mere designation, and in isolation from its basis of designation, then and likewise is able to establish that mere I functions as the agent which performs actions and is the experiencer of the results of those actions as well, a creator of karma and the experiencer of the results of karma, and one is able to establish that as a mere mental construct, a mere conventional designation, it's still able to perform all of those functions. Then one has arrived at the view, Madhyamaka view, middle way view, which integrates emptiness and dependent origination.
Oh yeah, that is not a challenge. And the castle, that we are saying that we chill, money by the keep on me. Many gaja government Jiji Menza Hama Lus, Kundan Swan Hashane, Tava Rashin Zavi Chil, Chenam Rashin, the Zavi Chil, Kasatao, Dashitin to Zawana, and in money body, Kasa Dashitin to Nigga Mare, Kasa Dashitin to Kuba Mayimba, Kasa Kuba Mayimba. Oh, Kasa Kumani body, the Kasa Kuba Mayimba, Tavi Rashin Zavi, money body Kuba me. Many Gashi government, the money beauty, and a can charge city government member. And a Gaza Rashi to a Gani, and a Gashula Karagore, say, money by the Mame Gaja coming, Jiji means them Lama Lu, Segala, and it means them Tanya, some Shah something now, Shah something, Kasan and now what or another money gaja mean go maybe Jiji means on Hamati. Tender we mean them the Tajim Kuru, which is one I say name. General Jane London, General Jane London, and the Zimbe Japan number ta means them the trainer should be T. So, Annie, you give us a wallet and the Ulumba, Jan Gabatan, Annie, or Yuki de Uchua. Or the Lando can tap this one. General Jane London, Zimbe, and it was Japan number Tabati on Govara. Japan number ta. Oh, yeah.
Japan number ta.
She is a draw.
Just a draw.
Ramin them Jitana, Shube, Mingan Tigi, and it's Chavate Dachaba. Minzam
Chawam.
Jen Saba Chabatan, Yunan Peva Chabatan, and it's Saduna Sovata, John Lando, and it's Jamba Chaba in the and it was to Java number Tabat on Grace.
Also, we number okay. Die long sikhet krang di
Tawi Ranshin Tawi Tawi Ranshin Tawi Chenam Je Ranshin Tatu de Nelu Tayi Gala Ane Dashi to the Zawa Tisana Ane Mani Badi Mani Padi Kuba Me Sigala Kanta Shi de Kuba Maris.
So now then another statement which says the same thing in a different way, using different words, is that when one is looking for the final nature of the view, and one finds that there's a negation is the result, that doesn't entail the the negation of the base, which is the base for the object which is negated. So here, what that's referring to is that if you're searching, for example, the person, you're examining how the person exists, and in the process of examining the person, looking for their intrinsic nature or intrinsic identity, what the result of that search is going to be not finding that intrinsic identity or that intrinsic nature of the person. And so in the process, what one actually ascertains is a simple negation, the absence of intrinsic existence, the absence of the intrinsic identity of the person. And when one arrives at that, one doesn't positively find the person, which is the basis of that absence of intrinsic existence or absence of intrinsic identity, but the fact that the person as such doesn't appear when one ascertains the absence of the intrinsic existence of the person does not entail that the person as such, the basis of that, has been negated in the process. So this is saying exactly the same thing as was said earlier, that when one arrives at emptiness as a simple negation, this doesn't negate the base, the thing that it's found with respect to, but and what's left over in this case, when you're looking for a person, once one has negated the intrinsic existence of the person, the intrinsic identity of the person, then what's left over is a mere name. The byproduct or the residue of this search is the remainder that's left over is nothing but a name, and yet, nevertheless, that name, which is simply a mental construct, which is nothing but a convention of language, a designation, a conventional designation, then that's all it is. But nevertheless, that mere name is able to operate as the agent which performs action and experiences the results of actions, and is also able to function as the thing which gets rid of all sorts of defects. It is able to operate as the agent which eliminates all of the things that are to be gotten abandoned in the course of the path, as well as the agent which produces all of the good qualities that are to be generated through the course of the path as well.
Oh yeah, that Rashi Chua Kani, and the Gabi Shidu Mingzam de Tanyazam to Shaya, the Casa de Timber, what to is Mingzam to Tanyazam, Tanya to the Mingzam de, and the Tanya to Chawachi to share Casa de Timber, Tanya to Shayati. Oh, yeah, that is that Kazan should be showing that Kazan de Guadaguda. Koja to some tender Rashi Meba Kailembala Yawa Mede or Sanjay Kawachi Paro to Chu, or Namjatadang was on the Sibichero, Sakawachi. Siduji Shawati Tuna Mejans. Castle Siduji Shawati Tuna, Demo Mejam. And all Mebata Tabar Mijude. Oh, and all Mebata Tabar Mijude around to be Tinu and Midiviju. Dijaji Cheji, Chijala around to be Tinu and Midubare. Sanjaji, their Maungu Chernam Sijang, Sanjagu Chertam Maungu Cherna Tade to Masibara. Their Maungu Cher Sijang Tade to the Maungu Chersina Tade to the Maungu Cher Yogo. That is a damn to there what I'm on but Massy. Sanjay good damn on that to some Chessy. Oh, there's no Taba Midjude or around to DG2, you are meted by Iza and a bit about it. Sanjay La Tata almost to be sure that there are more but to go and my days. Sanjay and it should to shame by Izala. Demomba and Sanjay Tata also to be sure that Demon would go and my day, and the Sanjay you should shoot them member. 최탐장 무슨 쓰바 이자 또거 봐야 미래의 뒤에서 매장 세워드려다 다다위 뒤에서 대화 매장 뒤에서 매장 길이 대모 무슨 쓰바래 무슨 쓰비치래 무슨 쓰비치로 대신도 나줘왜 매내시와 샤라양 뒤에서 매지 되게 매장 밀음 담바 통화시도 아니 지리사와 나와라 거요 말이 야
So thus, to conclude that, the agent which performs actions, creating, getting rid of that which is to be gotten rid of on the path, as well as the taking up the things that are to be done on the path, is a mere name, a mere convention, is merely conventionally designated. And then back to the text, we're on page 231, and the translation and verse 261a. B, the first part of verse 261, and last class we stopped where it says towards the bottom of that page 231, Buddhas directly perceive in the present even those things which will occur after 10 million aeons, though they are future at the time of the consciousness perceiving them. They are neither non-functional, uncreated, nor permanent, for they will not remain for a second moment after their formation. There is no need for a Buddha to cognize the present directly, it says explicitly here, or explicitly directly, and the past and future implicitly or indirectly, for though the latter do not exist at that time, they are in general directly perceived. So here this is saying that Buddha, it's not the case that the Buddhas perceive the present directly through perceptually, and then the past and the future in some indirect fashion through through inference or something like that, because even though it's the case that the past and the future do not exist during the present, they are nevertheless by Buddhas in general directly perceived through perceptually. Similarly, it is not contradictory for objects of aspiration, the way she's translating that, though they do exist and do not exist at that time, to appear clearly to yogic perception of that which is wished for, just as dreams appear to be real.
Oh yeah. 아니 내지 사변 여자 다도 누구 마주 와라 사변 내지 사변 여자 다도 누구 마주 와라 사변 내가 좀 아니 누구 마주 와 이자 홍조 인자 마오와 셰차위 셰차이 누구 되니 마오마 말에 누구 되니라 마오와 이시 셰미샤고 뒤前你了样 아니 다 대화다 뭐 다다와니了样 我在那心情是吧마음발라 자와 대신도 대니라야 반에 시와 차오 산제지 뒤숨타다 무슨 두수바 라루라开朗와 인지开朗와 차와 인지 도시 상호장도 나바 탐제도开朗와 미샤오 도시 상호장레만도 아니 무슨 두수바 말해서 어템 도시 상호장도 차바 나바 탐제도开没让我 미샤오 先让国看了样，毛毛让给我也把脚抬了，但毛毛原来让给我也把脚抬了，提人我也把再提人我也把门把他，毛毛让给我也不吃，那对刚才来讲了就不钱哦。
Now then, it continues by saying that even though the barley seed exists, this is in the present, the sprout which has not yet come into existence may be called future, but the sprout itself must not be called the future. And an understanding of the other two times should be inferred, actually it says inferred here, but one could say evaluated similarly from this. In our own system, we accept that Buddhas perceive all three times directly, perceptually, directly, without some mediation, and do not at all assert to to trainees that they merely appear to do so. I would change that translation a bit and say that so in this system, it's in our tradition we say that Buddhas perceive all three times directly, but one should not say that the Buddhas understand things merely as they appear to other beings, from the perspective of the beings that are to be trained. That's quite different, actually. And then likewise, there's another argument that follows actually the second half of the verse. For one for whom the future exists, there can be no distant time. Moreover, there cannot be a distant time for a protagonist for whom the future exists by way of its own intrinsic character, because the future exists in terms of its own intrinsic character. So this is conventionally, so previously it's rejected the notion of the past and future as they're posited as real, even from a conventional perspective. But if you attach here the thing to be negated, intrinsic existence or an intrinsic character, then likewise past and future, or future can't exist for this opponent who posits it in that way. So then again, moreover, there cannot be a distant time for a protagonist for whom the future exists by way of its own character, intrinsic character, because the future exists in terms of its own character. It would always be future. It can never be present.
Oh yeah. 아니 이번 미게 와차와 동바소라 고와 메바 라 고와 메바 타와니 가지 샤와 매장취 가지 샤와 매장취 연항에도 대미줄 지지 중세 전화야 더우여 봐 미스도 어서 나신전에 가지 샤와 매장취 가지 그비 신이당 태비 아니 최년 미관에 아니 아무 멤버라 추주송 와서前매장 추주송 와서前매장 아니 마음바 재수에 비관에 마음바 재수에 비관에 최연아 아니 마음부터 차중야와 동바 태매바 주대 차중야와 동바 태매바 주대 대마셔 봐야 아니 유체 마음 차주 마돈 받아야 아니 대유체르세 저부 유체르세 대마셔 봐라 유체르 지대대 티주비시도 중세前那样 저부 마음 버텨서 봐 미스 아니 미스 있으라 저부 양 버텨서 봐 미스 봐 마음 버텨서 봐 다란전지 주봐야 버텨서 봐 미스도
So next comes a demonstration that there would be the unacceptable consequence that one's activities such as restraining oneself from non-virtue would be pointless. There'd be no purpose to it. If the future existed in some sort of substantially existent way, then there would be no point in in taking on vows and avoiding non-virtue, restraining oneself from non-virtue if the future existed as a substantially existent thing. And that's given in verse 262. If virtue exists though nothing is done, resolute restraint is meaningless. If even a little is done, the effect cannot exist. And the commentary says, if because the future is substantially existent, virtue exists without actions such as safeguarding one's ethical conduct once one's faculties have become mature through meeting a spiritual friend and listening to teachings, resolute restraint from unethical conduct and so forth for the sake of future results, she says, such as a high rebirth, is meaningless, for virtue will exist even if that has not been done, meaning that restraint or all of the preparations and so forth, it would exist intrinsically. If even the slightest thing is done to enhance one's capability, future effects cannot be substantially existent. It is impossible. So here again, if the things exist intrinsically, have some kind of intrinsic character which would establish them as future effects, then one couldn't, whatever one did would have no effect on the future, or the future would occur regardless.
Oh yeah. 연ang 예동 때문에 주로서 아니 마음바 자수에 비고네 자수에 비치여나 마음바 아니 저부터도 차와서 나와 때문에 봐 주대세라 고 자주비나 아니 그 저부터 봐야 말아 그 저부터 자주 보면 라시 유튜브에 저부터 봐 매와 이제 대마셔 봐야 야나 아니 가서 내가 마돈 받수 좀 마순 봐야 아니 저부터 거래 제무시 충분히 예비세래. 지도 티주비지 조사주잖아. 안에 더 마음 받아도 여봐 메세.
So then what this is saying then is if the future was substantially existent, it couldn't be altered in any way. And then if you engage in ethical discipline right now, because the future is already fixed in that state, it wouldn't produce any kind of result. Or on the other hand, if the future is substantially existent, then even if you committed all sorts of very heavy negative actions, and if the future was already determined that you were going to experience happiness and pleasure, then those heavy negative actions could not produce any kind of results. So either alternative would entail, I mean, if a substantially existent future would entail that the efforts that one might make in the present would be pointless.
미다이나 치다부 저우연 예제 샤와주루 칸라 토마 타여바 테니직된 미다고 아니 두세 탄제 미다바 카일란바 티다나 오 탄제 미다바이나 아니 치다 저우지 명아로도 예제 샤와 미리데 미다이나 치다부 저우 예제 샤와주루 미리데 미다바지 명아여바 가위 기능을 여봐대 가용오 칸라서 미다바이나 아니 가면 사지 연구래서 기능으로도 아니 요매하지 고와이다 야와죠 칸라 토다 요매바 대다지대 미대체스세데 미다바 기능을 여봐 가위시 오 칸라야 사도 기회 토마당 랑 줍들래 아니 뒤니 줍들래 뒤니와 메데베 타여바지 랑주비 뒤에 뒤니와 믿어봐지다 믿어봐터지라 거라봐 그지 마사와데 데르와 인자서도 기회 토마다 랑주비 뒤에 뒤니와 믿어봐 타이바 텔라니 지대나 믿어봐시죠 그래.
The next shows that if something is impermanent, it's be contradictory for it to exist prior to its having arisen. And this is given in verse 263. In accordance with the assertion that all, and she's translating duce as composite things. I'm translating that as created things. Some people translate it as compounded things. I translate that as created things. In accordance with the assertion that all created things are impermanent, all functional things are impermanent. And then the verse says, if they are impermanent, how can it be said effects exist? That which has a beginning and end is called impermanent in the world. How can it be said that an effect exists prior to its production? It is unreasonable, since impermanence and existence prior to production are contradictory. Anything which has a beginning, in that it is newly produced, and an end, in that it does not last for a second moment after the time of its formation, is called impermanent in the world. So this is referring to the momentary nature of created things. They don't endure, they don't exist prior to their creation, and they don't exist for a second moment after they've arisen. So the momentary nature of created things is called and that's what's called impermanent in the world.
Oh yeah. 다 되게 이렇게 다 되제라 다 도대 와서 지대와 가바니 세 김바 매바 타주지 졸라마원 여마이 대다이나 참매바 되자기니 중화추르세 다 도대 와게 아니 가서래 대마오 아니 뭐부터 다다왕 뭐부터 이제 대순 거를 너도 와서 간다 뭐 왕고 중세 잠매 밤마와 티다나 아니 마음이 뭐 받아 아니 마음이 동아 도비 쳐도 아니 바람 깨박이 아니 점밤에 받아 주대 바람 깨비 쳐도 나무 공발라 점밤 점밤에 받대 점밤에 받아 주지 뭐 마음 밤에 쳐르세 아니 저와 자좀 봐라 마음이 뭐 여바 민배 티시도 자좀 봐그 님한테 제 방와 이상 아니 마음이 뭐 여바 민배 티시도 아니 좀 맞추면 거 봐, 좀 거 봐, 신호.
So then next comes a rejection of the position held by the Sautrantikas and others, this Buddhist school of philosophy, the Sautrantikas. This is given in verse 264. The verse says, liberation will occur without exertion. For the liberated there is no future. Or otherwise, if this were so, desire would arise without attachment. So the first part of this is, according to Sautrantikas, etc., and so forth, who assert that future functional things, created things, do not have the slightest existence. Liberation will occur without any exertion to generate the Arya path, path of the exalted or Aryas, in order to prevent future disturbing emotions and suffering, because future things do not exist, means totally would be totally non-existent.
Oh yeah. 대다이나 참에 봐 대자장이 중화 출 세대라 다 뭐뭐 봐 대다이나 그러와 대한 강사다 남시소 아니 차바 매봐 아니 대바 대자 제와 대자야니 중화 추나 주나 아니 주메디 주나 중화 주나 아니 주메디 중거래세 차단디 아니 주메디 주나 아니 다 좀 발라야 대자 제와 타비체를 양게데 마음바 매바 미생어라 마음바 매바 미시와오
So then that previous case would be like the liberated arhats, for whom there is no future mental affliction, etc., and who thus do not need to exert themselves because of them. So they're saying there that for the Sautrantikas, people would be like, even ordinary people would be like arhats, because the mental afflictions of the future cannot arise since they're non-existent. And then if the future were non-existent and desire to arise without there being a person, consciousness and so forth, or predispositions for attachment as a basis, then it would follow that desire would arise in an arhat as well, meaning that if the future were totally non-existent and desire arises without the person who is the basis for that desire arising, then it would occur, the absurd consequence would obtain that desire would arise in an arhat as well.
Oh yeah. 대사 장리 세리 장자티 세리 양그전에 마음을 매봐 줘봐 메시지 단이와 저우에메 다바 가바니 저우에나 칸데담 저우메에 칸데라 김지태도 가와라 소비견이 되면 주루 나 장전박이 아니 가서 매받게 면이 미치당 요거래 둘레 저분이와 여배세 다 좋아 탐제라 탐제 제와 타위냐와 말이 세시마와탕 다 제라도 마와니 가지기 뒤숨 재수와开량바 양자 재주도开량바 뒤숨과 재수여바开량바 소 기윙을 저분이도 강더바 당 기윙을 저우여바 더바 강더바 당 너데 와서 오버 담바 예장 저부 마음바 매바 저부 마음바 매바 마음바라 따바 용거 저부 마음바 매바이 강더바 태다라 dewu chimji tendo kawaso yeni ane temeba juwa ta sede dewu yoni kande da dewu meni kande ba chimji tendo kawala sobe jani teme churu satati bata.
Then next comes rejection of this position that the positions held by these other philosophers by examining whether or not results would exist or be non-existent, and that's given in the verse 265, which says that for those who assert effects exist and for those who assert they do not exist, adornments like pillars and so forth for a home are purposeless. There's no point. So here then the different positions that have been rejected are enumerated. Samkhya say that since what is non-existent cannot be produced, and since the effect is present in the cause in a potential form, the effect being present in the cause in a potential form, that's referring to the principle or nature, which is the source of all of the material developments in the world. Then, if the effect is present in the potential form, the fallacy that they say, the fallacy that anything arises from anything does not occur. Some Vaibhashikas assert that the three times are substantially existent and that effects exist prior to their production. Sautrantikas and so forth assert that although things are real, future effects are non-existent. Then it follows for all of them that adornments like pillars to decorate a home something to decorate a home are purposeless, since according to some these pillars would exist from the beginning, or the home would exist from the outset, and according to others the future home is non-existent, like a barren woman's child.
Cheramoakaji Tusum Tesu Bakala, Tuba Kantabatan. The Deva so Demba, over Demba Yang, Devu Mahomba Mebani, Kantabateta, and then Devu Mebatombatice. Then she go on to Juatas. Kajitana, Tambona Yubichitan, Shandatana, Chimaombala. Chimaomba meba motion put that some shero. Then the Jawala, that Ranu Dejin Jawa Juma, Rashimebara, Mawala, Kondo Shabagi, and you cook up to Sujeru to Devala, Devalang, and the Tegita, you cook up maybe Nashigi, and a Tamje lever trouble. So you can say, then you go Shanam, Papa Lobin Yamshaki, you have a massive badance. Then you go Shanam, Papa Lobby, Yamshaki, you have a massive bada, you have a Mayamba, you have a massive Baji, Chapter Mashabas, that Papa Yamshaki, Shini Sibi Sing or Masiba. Papa Yamshaki, see, Jan, Shini Sibi Sing or Masiba. Then you go China, Papa Lob, Papa Lobi Yamsha, Shuni Sibi Sing or Masibatan. Yaba Mayimba, Masibatan, Yaba Mayimba, Siba Niji, Chapra Masibatan. Ranuji Tanya Bitama, Leba, Draw Mashebe. Ranuji Tanya Bitama, Leba, Draw Mashebe, Trua Java, Tomacho and Nave, Tanju Luji, and the Tanya Bitama, Jordan Mashebagi, Trua Java, Toman Nave. Tanju Luji, the Itame to be turned like Kawachakure.
So then the various positions that have been enumerated, some of them say that the future, past, present, and future are substantially existent. Some say that the present is real, but or they say that the past and the future are not substantially existent, but that all things are real in some sense. So all of these different positions. In the first case, it's it's like for all of these adornments, like things that one would add or put up to create a home as a result are pointless, since according to some of them, the pillars and the home itself would exist from beginning, without any beginning, and already before it's created. And while according to others, the future home is non-existent. It's a completely non-existent thing, like a barren woman's child. So these either alternative or any of these various views entails those kinds of unacceptable consequences. But for proponents of dependent origination free from intrinsic existence, there is no possibility of error, and thus everything is properly established. So these kinds of mistakes that are made by these other philosophers based on their assumption that things exist intrinsically in some manner or another, either the future being existing as a substance, or the future being non-existent but real in some sense. These views are unacceptable and give rise to all those results. But if one holds dependent origination as in the sense of things being devoid of intrinsic existence, then these kinds of mistakes don't arise. And then it says here, in meditative equipoise, the Arya who are still learning, that is, these are Aryas, not Buddhas, but they're Aryas who have not yet achieved Buddhahood, do not, and she has perceive, I would it just says see dependent origination. They do not see dependently originated things as existent. But failure to distinguish between this non-seeing and the seeing of phenomena as non-existent, as well as the inability to posit conventional valid cognition in one's own system, is a scene appears to give rise to numerous errors. One must therefore master the meaning of the establishment of the two realities by valid cognition in our system. So this first point, that the Aryas who are observing, here you have to specify, it's from the perspective of their vision of reality that dependently originated things are not observed or seen, but it doesn't mean that they don't see dependently originated phenomena, because the dependently originated phenomena exist and for that vision, but the specific perspective of that Arya meditative absorption on the ultimate final nature of things, the object of that is the simple emptiness itself, the mere negation. So the phenomenal, conventionally existent things, phenomenal dependent originated things are not observed or not seen by that, but that doesn't mean that those things don't exist. It doesn't preclude that. But if you make that kind of mistake, then you're unable to posit conventional valid cognition as part of one's own system, and then all of the other kinds of errors which entail from not properly distinguishing the two realities through valid cognition.
Oh yeah, 가서래 타두지지기 시기 다 여든 그做다 타냐지지기 체면 여든做다 대만이 샤니. 是吧？他说的，让路去他也被采嘛，主要是那马些巴塞的，看的中国的，把这都说公嘛罗说的是吧？啊，开始说的，他都这边是写给，아니他都这边是写这个，아니他也被缺家养，或他也这个采嘛嘛用吧，他也这个采嘛这个。 아니 타도 이번에 지다와 또 남자 자고라 자이나 지다와 집에 남자 타도 집에 시래 지다와 또 남자 되게 지혜바 자양 지혜바 또 봐래지 아니 타녀주지 그 참아 많이 봐 지혜바 또 남자 되게 아니 가서래 지다와 자와래지 아니 타도 주지 그 참아 많이 봐 시대만이 가왜 아니 타도 주지 그 참아다 타녀주지 그 참아니 이거 대안 가와 가와 탄유지 그 참아대 세야지 가르치라서 이거나 시군도 담바 또바 담지 탄유지 그 참아 좀 메셔봐 무줘봐 내 전화도 견디온 거라 어떻지
시 컨트롤 담바 시 컨트롤 담바라
시군도 담바 또바 담지 아니 탄유지 그 참아 마셔 지다와 또비 남제디 그 시군도 담바 또장 그 탄유지 그 참아 마이 진여와 또비 남제디 그 세자 지다와 또장 그 지다와 또비 남제 지다와 또비 남제 마이 지다와 또비 남제다 진여와 또비 남제니 어디 가와 뒤유 군조다 전는 남반이 가와 신도 아니 타도 저그 참아다 탄유지 그 참아 지다와 또비 남제다 진여 또비 3년 참아니 어디 가와샤.
So now the point here is that one needs to properly if one doesn't properly understand how to establish conventional valid cognition within one's own system, then all kinds of different mistakes arise. This can be illustrated with respect to the ways, for example, the way in which a Buddha understands the ultimate reality of things and then the phenomenal reality of things. Ultimate reality and phenomenal reality are contradictory. That is, they're exclusive categories which subsume together. They subsume everything that exists. Something is either an ultimate reality or a phenomenal reality, but they're mutually exclusive categories. And so then, when a Buddha's omniscience has two dimensions to it. There's the omniscience in the sense of an awareness of the way things are, which is the object of that. The specific object of that is the ultimate reality of things. And then there's the Buddha's omniscience, which understands, knows things in their diversity, or in the Jinipa. I'm forgetting how I translate that. In their diversity, the diversity of things, which is a term for the phenomenal realities, all of the various other phenomenal realities. So, okay, putting this into English is extremely difficult for me right now. I'm sorry. The way it is that an omniscience knows everything, obviously. If it's omniscient, it knows everything. But in terms of the respective objects of the two aspects of omniscience, the omniscience in the sense of, which is in a sense focusing upon the ultimate reality of things, ultimate reality is the specific object for that, not the phenomenal things which are included, or conventional things which are included within the category of phenomenal reality. So, nevertheless, we have to say that omniscience, which is understanding the things as they are, the ultimate reality of things, it evaluates. This term is tough to translate. It measures, one could say literally, the phenomenal reality of things as well, so that it knows those phenomenal realities in addition to its sort of specific object, the ultimate reality of things. So it's not the case that it's exclusively cognizing the ultimate reality of things, rather it knows both, but its specific object is the ultimate reality of things. And then likewise, the Buddha's omniscience, which knows the diversity of things, which is in a sense focusing upon the plurality of conventional things and phenomenal things, that's its specific object, is these phenomenal realities, the diversity of everything other than emptiness, so that's its specific object. But it's not the case that it does not take the measure of or cognize the ultimate reality of things. It's simply that its specific object and the sort of focal point of it is the diverse phenomenal things that make up everything else other than ultimate reality.
Oh yeah. 다 되니? 다다와 된주 가봐 대라 아니 뭐나 용수 교와야 얘기잖니 재미주 대단하나 다다와 여바 미게 남지 또 가대 마오바 가장 대 마오 가장 다다와 니 여라 다다와 여배 마오바야 여바决定다시 지조티 마오비 내가 나네 조티 마오비 내가 나다 다다와 시 내가 수 규비치 아니 다다와 여도 세나 어쩌다 여도 세나 조 방법 되니 지조 방법 되니 라신大了 내가我们当学我那就用是教养没得不他是我那用是教养现在没得不他别的人教的往前没把大姐妹心里特别那个了呀就把一级讲怎么没就写的时候往前个也做过嘛的一些讲做过嘛的时候干了往前也没把大姐妹心里特别那了就把一级讲怎么没就写的啊
So next is a rejection of the idea that the present is real, is really established. And that's given in verse 266, where it says, now the opponent here is specifically a Samkhya, and in here it's saying, although the existence of past and future are being refuted or have been refuted, the present exists. Since it does, the future exists too, for the principle, this is again a technical term for material nature, which produces all of the manifold phenomena other than the person as the eternal knower. The principle, giving up its state of futurity, assumes the state of present curd, yogurt. Thus the present exists. And here it says, the reply to that is given in the verse, the transformation of things also is not perceived even by the mind. Those who lack wisdom, nevertheless, think that the present exists. And this continues by saying, it is not feasible for the principle, this nature, which is matter and permanent by nature, also to undergo temporary changes into things like milk and curd. Here she translates that. I think what that means is that the milk, which is previously existing, cannot transform, just like milk could not transform into yogurt or curd if it's permanent and material, then similarly the principle or the basic nature, material nature of things couldn't undergo any kind of transformations and produce things like milk and yogurt. Such transformations are not perceived even by mental consciousness that engages with extremely subtle objects, let alone observed by the 5 kinds of sense consciousness.
다다와단 티주 용서 주와 마음이 바 대단나 굉장히 대단나 나양 아니 가서 대단나야 다다와 여바 미게 남지 또 세대 다다와단 티 용서 주와 마음이 바 대단나 다다와 때마 여바디 태권이 되나 태권은지 되나 몸비기 미가 왔는지 또 받치 그래
Although transformation with respect to the present and its causes is not observed, those who lack wisdom and are ignorant about the meaning of reality consider the present to be real.
Oh, that gave an attention. So
here, if one could more extensively bring in the rejection of the positions of the Samkhyas that was given earlier and elsewhere as well.
당부 대라양 아체를 가나다 제주 오면 간다 다다리 버텨봐 오다 메다 가봐 내와다 메다 받치중 따라 가봐 이해주도 가봐 세제가 여유가나 다 담봉 내 민날 따바라 가봐 대랑 오다 오 내버라 힘이 비주체 이 예배나네 당오 내 민에 다 가봐 대라 오더라 내면 오 가라시 미다바네 가라유 가대 담보 내주나 타만님 바 민주로 다 뒤에 뒤에是多比中国也比起뒤에是民多啥个西中国也比起뒤에我是没有观念뒤에用是监狱机아니监狱机让人明白뒤에怎么出来也是越多些呐뒤에我是没有观念뒤에用是接把女比监狱机让人明白뒤에怎么出来越多些呐뒤에 경우 된도 칼라식 되면 다 내면 칼라식我那让些今年我没有钱就내면 칼라식我那让些今年没有钱让些今年我看了也看了样当样都没大白你看说的谁有钱才能几百没着几不钱
So next comes rejection of the reasonings that they employ. It's got multiple subdivisions, rejecting the idea that the cause of time, things, the cause for identifying some time, functional things are substantially existent, and that has multiple subdivisions. First of these is that rejecting refutation through examination of whether things endure or don't endure, and that has two parts: the actual refutation based upon that, and then the second one will come later, the evidence for things being that the duration is not intrinsically existent, and that's given in the first point is given in verse 267. So then here's someone might assert time exists because functional things that act as the basis for designating time. She's again using imputation for both designation and another term which means imagination or mental construction, dakpa. So designation, the time exists because functional things which act as the basis for designating time exist. Since time may be investigated by considering functional things but not on its own, time is real. And the reply to that is, how can there be things with no duration? Being impermanent, how can they endure? If they had duration first, they would not grow old in the end. How can functional things, which are the basis for designating time, for creating the notion of time, be real? It follows that they are not because of not having intrinsic duration, inherent duration. How could they have intrinsic duration? Since they are continually consumed by impermanence. Consumed here means disintegrate due to their impermanence.
yeah, that didn't 가대 담보 내주와 타만님바 민주로 세대라 시행 가대 담보 랑시지내와 윤여바 주나 아니 랑시지 주발라 도바 미스바 인장 원래 정도와 주와주미 랑시지 주나 주반도바 미스바 인장 가대랑 담보 랑시지내와 있나 타만님바 민주대 님바 민주와 다 랑시지 주발라 도바 미스피 주와 미스피 체 세가나 데레자 타만님바 민주로
So then the second half of the verse says, if they had duration first, they would not grow old in the end. So then again, applying the qualification that if duration, which is a basis for saying time or designating time, was intrinsic, if that had some kind of intrinsic existence, then things couldn't age and become old. Moreover, if things had intrinsic duration initially, they would not grow old at the end, because that which is intrinsically existent, which exists, established intrinsically, cannot cease. It's impossible for that to come to an end.
아니 기타 퇴행하지 이당 자위 나방고서 퇴행하지 이보지란 자수 좋아 남아 무엇을 대표거나 남아 미시 신도 남시까지 지금 대형가지 이단 저위 아니 전지 남아 무엇을 대표거나 남아 미시와 티쇼 남시까지 어제 이원이 돼지도 남아야 미시소 까지 이원이 남시까지 어제 이원이 돼지 아니 돼지도 남아 미시소 미시대 까지 제가 집에 남시까지 지고치 가나 아니 아마당 치마니 아니 돼지시와 연구 말다 되순 거세요.
So next comes the evidence that duration doesn't exist by means of its own proof, that duration doesn't exist intrinsically, it exists by means of its own intrinsic nature. And that's given in verse 268, where it says, just as a single consciousness cannot apprehend two objects, similarly two consciousnesses cannot apprehend one object. And the commentary here says, furthermore, there is no intrinsic or inherent duration, for just as a single moment of consciousness does not apprehend two consecutive objects actually presenting their own likenesses, it's a technical term there, that the object presenting itself in two specific aspects. Two consecutive moments of consciousness do not apprehend a single object simultaneously, for consciousness or undergoes a momentary production and disintegration. The consciousness is momentary, therefore a single moment of consciousness can't ascertain two distinct objects sequentially, and then likewise a single moment of consciousness, two consecutive moments of consciousness can't ascertain the same object because the object doesn't exist during that second moment.
Oh yeah. 남시 까지 이게 대형가지 이제잖아. 남시 참부 대형가마시나 남시 치마 가게와 가마가 아니 대는 남시 아니 가서 이요고 지금 다 대수는 있어서 또나 치용은 비도래 수라소비 대형가보 남시 레레싱 남시버레지 남시지 시와 저와 저와 가로세나 까지만 지바 카멜레나 산제바 미줄라스 이제 남시 까지버레 제가 까지 담보 지도 가나 아니 까지 님이 가라 그 아니 요까지 치마도 시주고 말아 대순 거서를 가로세나 까지만 지바 카멜레나 산제바 미줄라스 이제 전에 미자바 안 산제바 탐제 캐는 거 이제 까지만 지바 카멜레나 산제바 미 캐르나 미시지 미젠데 시중의 미시기 미젠데 시중의 시위 미젠이지만 미시까지 담비 미젠데 미젠소데 미시까지 니와가 아니 시와가 미젠쳐바데 시그마레 공가지 니와 예장 미시때 대게 남성같이 니와 지바르서 미시까지 담비 미젠데 소데 시중의 아니 미시 니 시중의 시위 미젠쳐바 미시데 미시까지 담비 시중의 미시냐 가서 가사를 와 미세요 미시데 네 되니 메시지 수 사월 쩨라 디제수 아니 메시지 제수 담바기 순지 메시지 제수 담에 또바기 디제수 좀 얘기 아니 되게 단자데 유 미사비스 또바 아니 게요 말했어
So then the objector might come back, or the opponent might come back and say, well, that contradicts the assertion in the Abhidharma Sutras, the Sutras on Metaphysics, that the five objects, such as visible forms, are each apprehended by two kinds of consciousness. And I'm not sure if that's... No, that's not right. That's not right. It says so that that contradicts the assertion in the sutras of Abhidharma metaphysics that the five objects, such as visual forms, are each apprehended by their respective types of consciousness. Each has their own specific consciousness. Each sense object has its own specific sense faculty and sense consciousness. So the answer, reply to that, if one does not accept momentary disintegration, one is not a Buddhist. And so that's the formula that all created things are impermanent. If one is a Buddhist, following Buddhist philosophical views, then one has to accept that as a Buddhist. If one does not, the object of observation of a visual consciousness cannot act as an object of observation for a subsequently arising consciousness. The sutra passage means that the visual consciousness cognizes the visible form, she just has form, but it should be visible form, clearly, and the mental consciousness, which is produced subsequently, cognizes it in an unclear way. So what this is saying then is that visual awareness, which is a momentary phenomenon, observes a visible object, visible form, which is also a momentary phenomenon. But the subsequent moment of visual consciousness cannot observe the same objective basis, the same object, which served as a basis for the arising of the prior visual consciousness, because that object, the objective condition, is called, the technical term, the visible form that produced the prior moment of visual awareness. That objective support for that observation is no longer existing in the second moment, just as the consciousness itself does not exist in its second moment, because it's a momentary phenomenon changing moment to moment. So here it says that the sutra passage means that the visual consciousness cognizes, or the implication of that passage that the opponent is adducing here, is that the visual consciousness cognizes the visible form clearly, meaning in a perceptual mode of cognition. That is, it's not apprehending it via the medium of a concept, and as is the case with thought. And the mental consciousness, which is produced subsequently, cognizes it's in an unclear way. Unclear here is again referring to mental awareness. Intellectual knowledge operates through the medium of concepts, which intervene between, in the case of knowledge of percepts, like visible forms and so forth, the intellect or mental consciousness here only cognizes them through the medium of concepts, and thus it's mediated in that way, and thus doesn't perceive them in clear, direct, or naked fashion, the way sense consciousness, sense awarenesses cognize things.
다니와 틀은 내가 예매 따라 가봐더라. 가데 틀은 내가 뜻을 민주로. 제대 내면 나 내봐 매바 타양 요마인 세. 나딜라. 내가 라신지 여대 안에 다다왜 차이 여비실. 있잖아. 아니 뒤다 내가 타대신. 아니 뒤 담바 추베 내가 연나. 아니 담바 추베 저와 이나 땡다 담바 죽거라. 죽거라. 가디 뒤라 내가 전생지 수지 대연나. 아니 내가 뜻을 민주로. 아니 뭐 타대 임배 전생지 수지 대연나. 내가 뜻을 민주대 아니 내가 뜻을 주와대 가와래. 세대라 그래서 가대 뒤에 내가 뜻을 민주로 세라 하냐 제대 뒤에 내가 매나 제대 뒤에 내가 매나 아니 뒤에 내가 매배 타를 아니 내가 매봐야 지봐야 여봐 마인배 뒤라시지 미네배 내가 타다고 사지도 밀어서
Next comes a rejection of some kind of real time, or real time, that time has duration in some real fashion, by examining whether or not duration exists or does not exist. And that's given in verse 269. The opponent here asserts that duration exists intrinsically. She has inherent existence, I would say. Duration exists intrinsically because of being the defining characteristic. She has defining characteristic of present time, of current time. And the reply to that is, if time and duration are different and have a real relationship, they must, she has inherently established, I would translate that as real relationship, they must act as basis and that which is based upon it. And then the verse says, if time has duration, duration is not time. If it has not, then without duration, there will also be no end. And commentary on that continues by saying, if duration relies on time as something separate, duration is not time because they are mutually exclusive. Here it's mutually exclusive. I don't see that in the Tibetan here. But anyway, if time does not have duration, then without duration there cannot finally be disintegration. Therefore, since time does not have intrinsic duration, the latter is unsuitable as the presence defining characteristic.
Oh yeah. That cause is so. Sumang midabatan jigda tata gaba tela. Midang we shana, midapa minjuro. Jena midang ye kan ye tining we de kala nes. Tatela never yete. Never done them be made up you with Chena. Then Kadim Midang Shana said, Kadim Mitapa, Kadim Mitapa, all Rashi Shanina, Rashi to be Shanina. Oh, Mitapa Mijuba, I don't know what Taba in Gore, Segana, oh, Mitapa Miju, oh, Taba in Gore. Oh, the Mitapa China, oh, the Mitapa Chipa China. Midaba Kanyin by Tek Kwana, Ani, or Midaba Kanyin by Tek Kwana, over Yimbe, Ani Rashi Kala now Missito. No, Rashi Kala now Missito.
So next comes rejection of this idea of real time by investigating, examining whether things, here referring to created functional things, and impermanence are identical or separate, are different. And that's given in verse 270. Duration exists because there are impermanent things that have duration. Reply to that is in the verse, if impermanence and things are separate, things are not impermanent. If they are one, since things are precisely that which is impermanent, how can they have duration? If impermanence and functional things are separate in nature, it says, or intrinsically separate or distinct, if they're intrinsically distinct things, it follows that things are not impermanent. If they have natures which are intrinsically separate or distinct from each other, impermanence and functional things, then they couldn't have any kind of relation, and it follows that things are not impermanent. If this is accepted, they must be permanent. They're either permanent or impermanent. If things and on the other hand, if things and impermanence are identical, since precisely that which is impermanent is a functional thing, then how can they have intrinsic duration? So impermanence, that momentariness, and their duration would be contradictories, and then duration would be impossible as well.
Oh yeah, that didn't. Now the Midaba top churchung gaba tell us some you be nine. That time Midaba never the top chuna, she call up a Midaba Tawani. Midani got to chun terry, now to chun Mayena, China Tang, our core, Cordoba. When our core, Nova Chi Tonga Juru, say, what did it? Never never thought chasing. 아니 메다바 또 충라 또 충이 전부 전부 미니바 이노시나 나위잖아 아니 나 또 쳐봐 이제 메다바 또 충하다 또 충이 아니 또 전부 전부 미누시나 아니 가서래 워낙 치네 대다 타는 메다바 균에 치는 대다 메다바 균은 나와 코도바 지 통화 지 통화 귤 통화 메다바 타서 담보되라 메다 니가 또 준대 나와 또 좀 많이 나 세대 대체제 나와 또 다들라 신의 대다 다른 미다바 주네 내가 고도바 지 통화 주데 통화 미다바 타 내위티 미다바니 강도 총화티 내가 또 총화 많이 미시티 말아 라시지 또단데 또단데라 대라 수장데 봐 미니 세레 라시지 또 또단데 봐라 수장데 미디 세레세 시장 대단내와 고 또바지야 통화 줄야
Next comes a refutation of the notion that duration and impermanence alter from time to time, depending on which one is dominant, which one is dominant at a particular time, and that has multiple subdivisions. First of which is if someone showing how it would be, it would necessarily occur that impermanence and duration wouldn't be able to exchange places. They couldn't. You couldn't alternate in terms of the dominance. If impermanence and duration were real, existed by means of their own intrinsic nature, then they wouldn't be able to alter at one point one being predominant, the other time the other being dominant, and that's given in verse 271. The opponent here asserts, while things continue to exist, duration is stronger and impermanence weaker, but it is not impossible for the weak to overcome the strong. The reply to that is, if duration is not weak because impermanence is weak, why should a reversal afterwards be seen? How can such a reversal be seen when things later finally become impermanent? It follows that that is unfeasible, impossible. If duration is not weaker because impermanence is weaker, while things continue to exist, nothing can harm that which has intrinsic or inherent strength, meaning that if these things are intrinsically powerful or weaker, then there's no way that they could alter in terms of which one is being dominant at a particular time.
Yeah, that's right.
Stop there.
Okay.